There is a moment before a medieval village truly exists. You find it just before dawn, standing at the edge of the place, where paths hesitate and fields do most of the talking. The ground underfoot is uneven and damp, pressed flat by generations of boots that knew exactly where they were going and never bothered to smooth the way for anyone else. The air smells of wet earth and old smoke, the kind that never quite leaves once it has learned the shape of a place. Nothing is moving quickly yet. The village has not woken, but it has stopped sleeping. This is the hour when animals have already made their decisions and people are still considering theirs. A rooster calls out somewhere ahead, too early and far too confident, as if daring the sun to disagree. It is answered by nothing at all, which does not seem to discourage it. You begin to walk. The path curves inward, gently, not inviting so much as assuming you will follow. On either side, low fences lean in attitudes of permanent surrender. Hedges have grown where they were allowed and spilled where they were not. Somewhere close, an animal shifts its weight, hooves finding familiar ground in the dark. You do not see it, but you do not need to. The sound is enough. Smoke begins to appear before people do. Thin strands lift from behind low roofs, rising straight at first and then unraveling as they meet the cooler air. The smell carries easily at this hour, unchallenged by noise or movement. It speaks of banked fires, damp wood, and meals that were never meant to impress anyone. The village is still holding itself together. Doors remain closed, but not firmly. You pass a cottage where a shutter has been left just slightly ajar, enough to let a pale line of light slip through. Inside, something moves. A pot is set down. A foot finds the floor. The day is assembling itself, one small action at a time. As you walk farther in, the path narrows without apology. What had been open ground becomes a lane that clearly has opinions about how many people it is willing to tolerate at once. Walls press closer here, made of stone that has forgotten its original shape and timber that has learned to bend rather than break. The ground dips, then rises again, never quite flat, as if refusing to encourage speed. A doorway opens suddenly on your left. Someone steps out, pauses, then steps back in again, having misjudged the moment. The door closes softly, with the quiet understanding that there will be another chance in a minute. No one appears embarrassed. Timing is a flexible concept this early. Chickens scatter ahead of you, moving with the loose coordination of creatures who believe deeply in the importance of being elsewhere. They cut across the path, hesitate, then choose a direction with enthusiasm and very little accuracy. Feathers brush against stone. One bird stops to stare at you briefly, as if trying to remember whether you are relevant, then decides you are not. The path bends again. Now the village begins to show its shape. Houses cluster closer together, sharing walls, leaning toward one another like neighbors who have heard the same story too many times. Between them, narrow passages open and close, offering shortcuts to those who already know where they lead and confusion to anyone else. Sound starts to collect, not voices yet, but signs of preparation. A bucket scrapes against stone. A latch lifts and falls. Wood shifts as something heavy is moved closer to a fire. These sounds do not compete, they take turns. You pass a stable set back from the lane, its door half open. The smell arrives before the animal does, thick and familiar, announcing presence long before movement. Inside, something snorts and stamps once, then settles again. unimpressed by your passing, and uninterested in the day's plans. The ground here is more worn. Boot prints overlap in places where people pause without realizing it. Near a corner, the path dips slightly, collecting water and the memory of yesterday's traffic. You step around it without thinking. Everyone does. The village has already trained you. Light increases slowly, not enough to banish shadow, but enough to soften it. Roof lines emerge from the dark, uneven and patient. The smoke thickens as more fires are encouraged into usefulness. Somewhere ahead, a bell sounds once, low and distant, not calling anyone yet, just reminding the village that it owns the morning. You keep walking. This is still the edge of things, where work has not fully announced itself and rest has not yet let go. The village feels gathered, coiled inward, waiting for the moment when movement becomes unavoidable. It will not wait much longer. By the time you move fully into the village, the paths have made up their minds. What was once a suggestion of direction tightens into something firmer, more opinionated. The lane narrows, as though it has remembered an old grievance, forcing you into a single line of travel that works only if everyone agrees to cooperate. Most people do. Some pretend to. Walls rise closer on either side now, built from stone that has settled into itself over centuries, and timber that leans forward slightly, curious about who is passing. Nothing here was designed for comfort or speed. Everything was built to last just long enough to be useful again tomorrow. A doorway opens ahead of you. Decisively this time, a woman steps out, carrying a bucket that immediately claims more space than it deserves. You slow without stopping, angling your shoulders instinctively. She does the same. For a moment, neither of you moves, each waiting for the other to decide how important their errand really is. The bucket wins. You step aside, boots finding the edge of the path, and continue on as though this had been planned all along. The lane widens briefly, then narrows again. Here, a low wall forces everyone to turn slightly, guiding bodies the way water is guided, not by instruction but by insistence. Someone ahead pauses to adjust a strap, creating a brief ripple of stillness behind them. No one complains. Pauses like this are already built into the day. Chickens reappear. Emboldened now by daylight, they move in loose formation, crossing the path in a way that suggests urgency without direction. One stops directly in front of you, head tilted, as if waiting for the road to explain itself. It moves at the last moment, offended by nothing in particular. The smells begin to layer. Wood smoke thickens as more fires are stirred into usefulness. Damp straw clings to the air near doorways. Somewhere nearby, a stable contributes its opinion without apology. You pass it quickly, not out of offense, but experience. The village has taught you which smells are worth lingering over and which are better met in passing. People appear in short bursts. A man steps out of a cottage, pulls the door closed behind him, then stands still, scanning the lane as though waiting for the day to give him permission. He sets off just as someone else arrives from the opposite direction, and the two negotiate the space between them without a word. One turns sideways. The other pauses. Both continue, satisfied. You notice how often this happens. The village runs on small, unspoken agreements. Who yields? Who waits? Who pretends not to see? The paths enforce these rules gently but firmly, narrowing where patience is required and opening just enough to reward cooperation. A cart appears ahead, stationary and unavoidable. It has been left at an angle that suggests it was meant to be temporary and then forgotten. Its wheel claims the center of the lane with quiet authority. People pass around it in practiced arcs, some stepping into doorways, others flattening themselves briefly against walls. You follow suit, turning your shoulders, stepping where the ground dips slightly, and emerging on the other side without breaking pace. The cart does not apologize, nor does the wall that juts out unexpectedly a few steps later. Its stones worn smooth at hip height by centuries of similar encounters. You adjust again, barely noticing. The village rewards those who stop expecting clear paths. Sound grows steadily now. Footsteps overlap. Buckets clink. A latch snaps open and shut. Somewhere close, a child laughs once, sharply, before being reminded of something important. The sound does not linger. Nothing lingers unless it insists. You pass a cluster of cottages pressed close together, sharing walls and warmth and whatever news traveled fastest the night before. Here, the lane feels narrower still, though it has not changed. The difference is people, more of them now, moving with purpose, crossing your path, joining it, leaving it again. A door opens suddenly on your right. Someone steps out too quickly, collides lightly with another passerby, and mutters something that could be an apology or a complaint. It does not matter which. They separate and continue on, each convinced the other will manage. The ground underfoot changes. Packed earth gives way briefly to stone set unevenly, slick with damp where the sun has not yet reached. You shorten your stride without thinking. Others do the same. The village does not announce hazards. It assumes you are paying attention. A narrow passage opens between two buildings. You glance down it as you pass. It is just wide enough for one person, leading somewhere private and none of your concern. A bucket rests against the wall, there, waiting. You keep moving. Curiosity here is rarely rewarded. The lane widens again, almost generously. For a moment, movement becomes easier. People spread out slightly, shoulders relax, pace quickens. The relief is brief but appreciated. Someone takes advantage of the space to overtake another, stepping ahead with the quiet confidence of someone who knows it will not last. Narrows and draws everyone back into close agreement. A gate stands open ahead, its hinges protesting softly as people brush past. Beyond it, the village grows louder, denser, more certain of itself. You adjust your pace, falling naturally into the rhythm of those around you. The village has you now. Every step forward is guided by walls, doorways, and the unspoken rules of shared space. There is no need to hurry. There is nowhere else to go. You continue inward, carried by the path as much as by your own feet. As the village tightens around you and prepares to show you what it does with its mornings, you feel the center of the village before you see it. The air changes first. It thickens, warming in uneven patches, carrying smells that arrive early and refuse to wait their turn. The path beneath your feet grows firmer here, packed hard by traffic that does not slow simply because morning has finished stretching. The village has reached its working voice, and it speaks loudly without ever raising it. Sound gathers from all directions. Metal strikes metal somewhere ahead. Steady and unhurried, a rhythm so consistent it feels less like noise and more like a measure of time. Each blow lands with confidence, followed by a brief pause that suggests the hammer knows exactly when it will be needed again. You pass closer and feel the vibration travel through the ground. Before the heat reaches you, the forge announces itself without asking. Heat spills outward in waves, nudging you along the edge of the lane. People orbit this place naturally, adjusting their paths as though following an invisible current. No one lingers longer than necessary. Work here is loud, hot, and useful, and it has no interest in conversation. You move on, and the sound recedes behind you, replaced almost immediately by something softer. The smell of bread arrives in layers, warm and reassuring, drifting out ahead of the building that produces it. People slow here without meaning to. Heads turn slightly, hands pause. Even those with somewhere important to be take a longer route than necessary, letting the scent do what it does best. The oven sits back from the path, stone darkened by years of service. Someone stands nearby, shifting loaves with practiced motions, their attention fully claimed by heat and timing. You do not stop. Neither does anyone else. The work continues, whether it is admired or not. The lane grows crowded. Stalls have appeared. Where there was empty space earlier, assembled quickly and with the confidence of repetition. Tables lean forward under the weight of goods that look identical until you are close enough to notice differences that matter. People cluster and separate, forming small knots that dissolve as easily as they formed. You step around them, guided by sound and habit. A voice calls out, but with the steady persistence of someone who expects to be heard eventually. It is answered by another, then another. The words blur together, stripped of urgency by familiarity. No one is persuaded quickly here. That would be suspicious. The air shifts again. This time it is sharper, heavier, carrying a smell that suggests work best done at a distance. People pass this stretch of the lane briskly, eyes forward, steps quickening without explanation. Whatever happens behind those walls does not need an audience. You do not look long. Farther on, the sound changes once more. Wood creaks under pressure. Something is being shaped patiently, its form emerging stroke by stroke. The rhythm here is slower than the forge, more deliberate, each movement measured against the last. Chips fall and are ignored. They will be dealt with later. The village center hums now. Everything overlaps. Smells compete and then settle. Sounds rise and fall in layers, never fully stopping, never quite drowning each other out. People move through it all with practiced ease, adjusting paths, lifting loads, setting things down again. No one explains anything. If you hesitate, the village waits. If you move, it accommodates. There is no single direction to follow, no clear line through the middle. You choose a path by instinct, guided by space, sound, and the simple understanding that if you block the way, someone will let you know. A cart edges through the crowd, its progress slow and unstoppable. People part just enough to allow it through, stepping aside, flattening briefly against walls, then closing ranks again once it passes. The cart leaves behind the faint smell of grain and effort. Someone sweeps at the ground with a foot, more out of habit than hope. Heat rises from the stone underfoot. The sun has reached high enough to claim the open spaces now, pressing warmth into the center of the village. Shade gathers along walls and under overhangs, claimed quickly and without ceremony. People stand where the air feels slightly kinder. Even if they cannot say why, you pass through it all, carried forward by the steady movement of others. This is the village at full voice. Not chaotic, not orderly, but functioning exactly as intended. Work spills outward into every available space, shaping the day through sound, smell, and motion. Ahead, the lane begins to open again. The crowd thins just slightly. The air cools. The noise softens at the edges. The village, having shown you its busiest heart, begins to ease its grip, preparing to turn inward once more. You continue walking, leaving the center behind as the work carries on without noticing your absence. The change arrives quietly. There is no signal to mark it, no moment when the village decides to slow. Instead, the noise you have been walking through begins to spread out, thinning just enough to notice. Sounds no longer stack on top of one another. They sit beside each other instead, leaving small gaps of silence between them. You keep walking. The path widens here, not generously, but with less resistance. Fewer shoulders brush past you. Fewer adjustments are required. People still move with purpose, but that purpose has lost its urgency. What needed doing has begun. What remains will take as long as it takes. Heat settles into the stones. It rises slowly, pressing upward through the soles of your boots, warming the air closest to the ground first. Shade becomes noticeable now, not because it is rare, but because it is earned. People drift toward walls and overhangs without comment, pausing just long enough to feel the difference before moving on again. But it sounds different. The sharp rhythms you passed earlier soften into longer stretches of effort. Tools are lifted and set down with more care. Movements grow economical, each one doing exactly what it must and no more. The village has reached the part of the day where wasting energy would be foolish. You pass a cluster of people standing together, close enough to suggest conversation, quiet enough to suggest none. They shift their weight. Someone wipes their hands on a tunic. Another leans briefly against a wall, then straightens again, as though reminding themselves they are not finished yet. No one mentions the heat. It is already understood. The air carries fewer smells now. Bread has been claimed. Smoke thins. What remains is the steady scent of bodies at work, and the dust stirred by feet that have been moving since dawn. It hangs low, settling slowly, unbothered by whether anyone notices. A narrow lane branches off to your right. You glance down it as you pass. It is quieter there, shaded, its stones darker with damp. A bucket rests against the wall, forgotten or waiting. You do not turn. Midday is not the hour for detours. The village feels closer together here, not crowded, but compressed, as though everything has drawn inward slightly to avoid the sun. Voices lower without effort. Movements tighten. People pass one another with less ceremony, more familiarity. There is an unspoken agreement that this part of the day is to be endured, not embellished. You walk on, your pace adjusting to match the general drift. The path curves gently, guiding you through a stretch where the buildings seem to lean back just a little, offering space without generosity. Doors stand open now, not wide, but enough to let air move through. Inside, you catch brief impressions: shadowed rooms, a bench, a jug, the quiet presence of rest waiting to be claimed later. Somewhere nearby, water is poured. The sound is unmistakable. A brief splash, followed by a pause, then another. People slow almost imperceptibly as they pass, ears tuning in before reason intervenes. The sound fades quickly, leaving behind the faintest sense of relief. The village does not stop. It never does. It simply shifts its weight, redistributing effort so that the day can continue without breaking anyone outright. This is the hour when everything is done more carefully, when paths feel longer and corners are taken wider. You notice how often people stand still now, not resting exactly, just standing. A moment between movements, a hand on a hip, a shoulder rolled once, then left alone. The village has learned that stillness can be useful if it does not linger. The soundscape flattens further. Nothing dominates. Everything contributes. The village hums at a lower pitch, steady and unremarkable, as if conserving its voice for later. Ahead, the light begins to change again, subtle but certain. The sun shifts just enough to soften its edge. Shadows stretch slightly longer along the walls. The path ahead looks familiar in a different way, as though it is already preparing for the return journey. You continue walking. The village moves with you, not hurrying, not resisting, settling into the long middle of the day with the quiet confidence of something that has done this many times before. You notice the change not by what appears, but by what begins to retreat. The village does not announce the end of its working day. It never has. Instead, it begins to draw its edges inward, slowly and without agreement, like a tide that has decided it has come far enough. The path beneath your feet feels the same, but the way people use it does not. Movement that once pushed forward now doubles back. The direction of travel loses its urgency. You keep walking, but the village is no longer pulling you along. People pass you, heading the other way now, not in a hurry, not lingering either. Tools are carried differently, balanced instead of gripped, resting against shoulders rather than held ready. Someone ahead pauses to adjust a strap that no longer needs to hold weight. Another stops to wipe their hands on a tunic already marked beyond concern. The air cools in small, uneven patches. Shade stretches farther across the lanes, reaching places it could not touch earlier. The heat that pressed down at midday loosens its hold, lifting just enough to be noticed. You feel it first on your shoulders, then along your back, the relief arriving quietly. Like something that knows better than to make a scene, the sounds of work begin to thin. They do not stop all at once. One rhythm drops away, then another. The steady beat you heard earlier fades into distance, replaced by softer noises, a latch closing, a bucket set down, footsteps slowing rather than stacking. Where the village once spoke over itself, it now waits its turn. You pass a doorway where someone stands half in, half out. They lean against the frame, watching the lane as though expecting it to say something important. It does not. After a moment, they step inside again, leaving the door open just enough to let the air move through. Inside, you catch a glimpse of shadowed space, of quiet, waiting patiently for the evening. The path curves gently here, guiding you back toward places that feel familiar now, earlier. You walked with the flow, carried forward by density and noise. Now, you walk through gaps, spaces opening where there had been none. The village feels larger in this state, not because it has grown, but because fewer people are claiming it all at once. A cart stands abandoned at the edge of the lane, not forgotten, just finished with 4 now. Its wheel rests against a stone, angled slightly, as though placed with intention. People pass it without adjustment, stepping around it easily. What once demanded attention now barely registers. The smells shift again. The sharper edges of the day recede, replaced by warmer, quieter notes. Wood smoke returns, thicker now, no longer hurried. Somewhere nearby, something simmers. The scent does not chase you, it waits. You notice how often people pause in doorways, not entering fully, not remaining outside either. Thresholds become popular at this hour. People stand with 1 foot inside, 1 foot out, stretching the moment between obligation and rest. Conversations, if they happen at all, are brief and practical, spoken low and left unfinished. The village has begun its inward turn. Paths that once funneled people toward the center now lead them away from it. You recognize the pattern without needing it explained. The day has been spent. What remains is to gather what is needed and let the rest go. Footsteps soften around you. The pace slows naturally, as though everyone has agreed to give the ground a break. You hear fewer hurried movements, fewer sharp sounds. The village no longer feels like a machine in motion. It feels like a collection of places returning to themselves. Light changes again. The sun dips low enough to cast longer shadows across the lanes, stretching them toward doorways and walls. Stone cools underfoot. The air settles, losing its edge. The day exhales, and the village exhales with it. You continue walking, but now you are no longer being guided forward. Instead, the village seems content to let you pass through it at your own pace, offering familiar sights without insistence. Everything that needed doing has been done, or set aside for tomorrow. There is no need to hurry anyone now. Ahead, the paths narrow once more, leading toward quieter spaces. Places where voices lower without effort and movement begins to slow into stillness. You follow. Not because you must, but because this is where the village is going. By the time you reach the first doorways that truly close behind you, the village has already decided that the day is finished. The paths are quieter now, not empty, but settled. Movement still happens, though it no longer claims attention. People slip indoors without ceremony, disappearing into spaces that swallow sound almost immediately. Doors close with the soft confidence of repetition, not slammed, not hurried, but firm enough to mean it. You slow your walk. Here, the village turns inward completely. What remains outside is minimal. The last few footsteps, the low murmur of voices drifting briefly and then fading. Smoke thickens again, heavier now, less concerned with dispersing itself. It clings to roof lines and settles into corners, familiar and unremarkable. The houses press closer together. They always have, but at night the closeness feels intentional. Walls lean toward one another as though sharing warmth. Roofs dip low, drawing the eye downward. These are not buildings meant to impress. They are built to endure, to keep out wind, to hold heat, to make the night manageable. You pass a doorway just as it opens inward. Warm air spills out briefly, carrying the scent of cooked grain and damp wool. Inside, firelight flickers against walls, darkened by years of smoke. The light does not travel far. It pools low, illuminating what is necessary and leaving the rest to memory. The door closes again, and the sound disappears with it. Inside, the space is smaller than it looks from outside. Ceilings hang low, encouraging stillness. Walls are uneven, their surfaces shaped by hands rather than tools. Everything inside the room serves more than one purpose. A bench that is also a table, a chest that holds clothing and weight, a corner claimed by sleep and nothing else. You continue past other houses, catching glimpses as you go. In one, someone stirs the fire carefully, coaxing it into a quieter state. In another, voices murmur briefly, then drop lower, words becoming indistinct. The village does not fall silent all at once. It dims gradually, like a room where lamps are being turned down one by one. The air changes as you move deeper into these spaces. Outside, it cools quickly. Inside, warmth gathers close to the body. The contrast is felt most sharply in doorways, where people linger for just a moment longer than necessary, stretching the boundary between the two. These thresholds have learned patience. They see this hesitation every night. You imagine the interiors without seeing them. Floors packed earth or rough plank, cool under bare feet. Straw laid thick in corners, shaped to familiar outlines. Blankets folded and unfolded until they no longer remember being new. The fire, now reduced, speaks occasionally, a soft shift, a settling ember. The quiet punctuation of rest. The village narrows further. Lanes become passages. Passages become spaces between walls. The sky overhead thins to a strip, dark and even. Light here comes only from windows set low, their glow muted, their reach short. No one is lighting anything for show. You notice how sound behaves differently here. Footsteps soften. Voices do not carry. Even your own movement seems to absorb itself, as though the walls are listening and choosing not to repeat what they hear. The village has reached the hour where nothing needs to travel far. A door opens ahead, then closes. Someone laughs once inside, a short sound, quickly stilled. The moment passes. The house holds it. This is how the village rests, not with silence, but with containment. Each home gathers its sounds, its warmth, its people, and keeps them close. Outside, very little remains. A cat moves along a wall. An animal shifts in its shelter and settles again. The world reduces itself willingly. You slow until walking feels optional. There is nowhere left to go. The paths lead only to more doors, more walls, more spaces already claimed by the night. The village has folded itself inward completely, becoming a collection of quiet rooms rather than a place of movement. Firelight flickers behind shutters. It rises and falls gently, steady enough to trust. Inside, bodies stretch out on straw and wool, finding positions that will do. The day's weight loosens gradually, not released all at once, but redistributed until it no longer presses. Breath slows, not just inside the houses, but everywhere. The village breathes as a whole now, a shared rhythm settling in. Outside, the air cools further. Inside, warmth holds. Nothing else is required. The walk ends without needing to be announced. The village remains enclosed, quiet, complete. Walls do their work. Roofs keep their promises. The night takes over what the day has finished with. You do not need to stay. The village will keep itself until morning.